the day police arrested me changed my life forever. The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists at 6:47 in the morning, and I remember thinking, this is how it ends. Not with a fight, not with a chase, but with cold metal against my skin and the distant sound of my mother screaming my name from the front porch of the only home I had ever known. The neighbors were already at their windows. I could feel their eyes like stones against my back. I was 19 years old, and in that single frozen moment, every choice I had ever made, every shortcut, every lie I had whispered to myself about survival, I collapsed into the weight of those two officers guiding me into the back of a police cruiser. The door shut. The world outside went silent, and for the first time in a long time I had nowhere left to run. I grew up in a part of the city where opportunity felt like a rumor, something people in magazines talked about but nobody on our block had ever actually touched. My father left when I was 7. My mother worked double shifts at a laundromat, 6 days a week just to keep the electricity on and food in the refrigerator. I watched her wear herself down to almost nothing, and instead of being moved by her sacrifice, I became angry at the world that made her work so hard for so little. That anger made me easy prey for the wrong kind of people. By the time I was 15, I was running with a group of older boys who had already decided that the rules of society were written for other people. I told myself I was just surviving. I told myself I had no choice. But deep down, in a place I refused to visit, I knew I was choosing destruction one small decision at a time. The arrest was for theft, not something dramatic or cinematic, just a string of petty crimes that had finally caught up with me the way gravity always does. I had been stealing from local businesses, convincing myself that faceless corporations didn't count as real victims. But one of those businesses was a small grocery store owned by an elderly Vietnamese man named Mr. Phan, who had built his entire life savings into those 4 walls. When the detective explained this to me in the interrogation room, showing me the footage of myself walking out with merchandise, that meant nothing to me and everything to him. Something inside me cracked. Not broke, cracked. Like the very first fracture in a dam that doesn't know yet how much pressure is about to come. I spent 3 months in a juvenile detention facility. 3 months sounds like nothing when you say it out loud, but when you are 19 and you have been stripped of your phone and your freedom and your identity, 3 months feels like a different lifetime. The first week I was defiant. I told myself this was just another obstacle, that I would get out and go right back to the only life I understood. The second week, the silence started to do something to me. There were hours in that place where there was nothing to distract me from my own thoughts, no noise to drown out the voice inside my head that had been waiting patiently for years to be heard. By the third week, I had started to listen. There was a counselor, their name Mrs. Delgado. She was a small woman with reading glasses. She was always pushing up her nose in a manner of speaking that was so quiet and unhurried that it felt almost out of place in that building. She didn't treat me like a case file. She didn't talk at me the way the system usually did, as if my entire existence was a problem to be managed. She sat across from me in those plastic chairs and asked me questions that nobody had ever bothered to ask before. What did I love as a child? What did I want when I was young before everything went sideways? What was I so afraid of that I had spent years running toward danger just to avoid sitting still? I didn't have answers right away, but the questions stayed with me, rattling around in my chest like seeds finding soil. My mother visited me every single week. Every single one without exception. She would take 2 buses and walk 6 blocks and sit across from me, behind that plexiglass with her tired hands folded on the table, and she would look at me, not with shame, not with anger, but with a love so fierce and relentless that it was almost painful to receive. She never once said, "I told you so." She never once made me feel like a lost cause. She would just tell me about her week, ask about mine, and before she left, she would always press her palm flat against the glass and wait for me to press mine against hers from the other side. That gesture undid me completely, every single time. There is no loneliness in the world quite like the loneliness of being loved that deeply by someone you have repeatedly failed. If you believe in kindness and second chances, drop a like on this video right now, because this story is proof that one moment of grace can completely change the direction of a human life. When I was released, I was given a list of conditions in a court-ordered community service assignment at a local youth center. I showed up on my first day with my arms crossed and my jaw set, ready to clock hours and disappear. What I was not ready for was the room full of 12 and 13-year-olds who looked exactly the way I had looked at their age, hungry for something they couldn't name, standing at the exact same crossroads where I had taken the wrong turn. One of the program coordinators, a man named Jerome who had done time himself and come out the other side, handed me a basketball and pointed at the court and told me to just be present. Just be there. That was all he asked. Something happened on that court that I still struggle to describe. Those kids didn't know my story. They didn't know I had just come out of detention. They just saw an older guy who could play ball and who showed up for them. For the first time in my life, someone was looking up to me, not because I was dangerous or connected or willing to take risks, but simply because I was there, consistently, reliably, physically present. I started to understand in a slow and dawning way that showing up is its own kind of power, that the most revolutionary thing I could do in my world was simply to not disappear. Jerome saw something in me that I hadn't yet learned to see in myself. He encouraged me to get my GED, which I had abandoned years ago. He sat with me through the parts that were hard. He drove me to the testing center on a Tuesday morning in his beat-up Honda and waited in the parking lot for 2 hours reading a paperback novel. And when I walked out with a passing score, he shook my hand and said, now we start the real work. I didn't fully know what he meant then. I understand it completely now. I went back and apologized to Mr. Fan. It took me 4 months to work up the courage, and when I finally walked into his store on a rainy Thursday afternoon, he looked at me for a long moment without speaking. I told him who I was. I told him what I had done. I told him I was sorry, and not the careless kind of sorry, but the kind that lives in your bones. He was quiet for so long that I thought he was going to call the police again. Then he walked out from behind the counter, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said that he had prayed for me, not against me, for me. He had looked at the footage of that young man stealing from his store, and he had prayed that something would happen to wake him up before it was too late. Standing there in that little grocery store with the smell of rice and dried herbs in the air, I felt the full weight of what it means to be forgiven by someone you have wronged. It is the heaviest and most liberating feeling in the world. That was 5 years ago. Today, I work full-time at the same youth center where Jerome first handed me a basketball. I run after-school programs for teenagers in the same neighborhood where I grew up. And I tell them my story, and not to impress them, not to warn them from a place of superiority, but to show them that the version of themselves that makes the worst choices is not the final version. I went back to school part-time. I am 3 semesters away from a degree in social work. My mother came to my first awards ceremony at the center, and when they called my name and she stood up and clapped with tears running down her face, I finally understood what I had almost thrown away. Not just my own future, hers. The day the police arrested me, I thought it was the end of everything. I know now that it was the beginning of the only life worth living. It was the moment the universe finally got loud enough to make me stop and listen. Not every rock bottom looks like a tragedy. Sometimes it looks like handcuffs in the early morning, and a mother screaming your name, and a police car door closing behind you on a street you thought you knew. Sometimes the thing that breaks you open is the same thing that finally lets the light inside. Before you scroll away, drop a comment below and tell me, has someone ever believed in you when you had stopped believing in yourself? Your story might be exactly what another person needs to read today. Let's fill this comment section with hope. I think about Mrs. Delgado sometimes, and her quiet questions in those plastic chairs. I think about Jerome and his beat-up Honda in the parking lot. I think about Mr. Fan and his prayer for a stranger who had wronged him. I think about my mother's palm pressed against the glass. None of these people had any obligation to invest in me. Every single one of them chose to anyway. That is the truth that reorganized everything. I thought I knew about the world. That kindness is always a choice, and some people choose it even when they don't have to, even when you have given them every reason not to. If even one person watching this story is standing at the crossroads where I once stood, I want you to hear this as clearly as I can say it. You are not too far gone. You are not beyond the reach of the life you were meant to live. The arrest, the failure, the worst thing you have ever done, it does not have to be the last word. It can be the turning point if you let it. It was for me. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe, because every view helps this message reach someone who needs it tonight.